Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing Chapter 24 out of David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. And this deals with the other half of the 1920s, okay, the actual conservative aspect of how society, the traditional aspect of society, that is, begins to push back against a lot of the new social movements, against the new, social trends and stuff, the sexual revolution, against popular culture and so forth. This is the conservative aspect, okay? And conservative society in the 1920s is extremely fundamentalist in the way that it handles things. There is an enormous amount of pushback with this older generation, and it tends to be the older generation, okay? The one that has not gone off to war, has not experienced the horrors of the First World War, as the people who are left behind, who are typically of an age where they were not drafted, and who have continued on in the same vein of traditionalism the entire time the war has been going on. So this is a completely different contingency of society. In many cases, it's the parents and the grandparents of the people who have gone off to war, or the people who are embracing these new social norms in American society. So now we can kind of get into kind of the pushback on all these things. For the most part in the United States, again, the whole idea of the Roaring Twenties and the stereotypical image that we get of the flappers and the jazz age and all that kind of stuff, most of that is actually a very small percentage of what actually is going on in the United States. The normal, and again, we've talked about relativism here, the relatively normal aspect of American society is steeped in traditionalism. America is still very much a society that has still lagging on to the idea that Woodrow Wilson has about democratic Christianity. Again, for the most part, this is not 100% by any means. But America is still very xenophobic in terms of immigrants, right? People are still giving sidelong glances at newcomers to the United States. They don't necessarily trust the other nations of the world. And in some aspects, especially after the First World War and us getting involved in it. Again, this was a foreign war that many Republicans didn't necessarily want to get involved with in the first place. Okay, the Republican Party, which is gradually becoming the more conservative party at this particular point in time, has still wanted to keep America relatively isolated, right? Has wanted to keep business interests concealed within the United States. And so the democratic aspect of society, though, is wanting to go more global. Okay, so this desire to keep everything here on the shores of America is still very much the traditional Republican ideology. And Nativism becomes more of a hardline movement during the 1920s, more so than at any other point, okay? Because we've gone through several waves of immigration now into the United States, and Nativism becomes the overwhelming ethnocentric and xenophobic response to that. In other words, it's very, very much anti-immigrant, okay? The idea that we don't want immigrants here. We think they're here to steal our jobs. They're changing the way we live. They're changing societal standards. And in some cases, it goes even to the point of just flat-out racism, right? Pointing out what they believe to be the negative aspects of one given culture or another, whether it's their appearance, their attitude, their religion, their language, their dietary habits, whatever it happens to be, right? They find something to latch on to push it away. And coupled with that tends to be an overwhelming militant Protestantism in the United States, especially in the South. Okay, and the South is still hasn't quite gotten very far since the end of the Civil War. Okay, in terms of its economy, right? It's begun to industrialize a little bit, but still most of the South is very much entrenched in this traditional mindset. And again, this is not necessarily just in the South by itself. I should point that out. Okay, a lot of the United States is still steeped in this, not just in the South, but also in the Midwest, in certain parts of the North, and even in certain places out west as well. And again, from 1919 until 1924, we get more than 600,000 immigrants who come in from southeastern Europe. Okay, and this is that area of Europe that has just been racked by the First World War. Okay, these are the individuals who, again, to use the metaphor of the ant mound, right? We've kicked the ant mound with the war, and the ants are now going everywhere, right? The people are scattering, and many of them are coming to the United States. And sometimes these are individuals who are, again, just trying to escape the social upheaval. Sometimes they're trying to find a better way of life and so forth. Sometimes they want to migrate permanently, and sometimes they want to do it temporarily, okay, just until things settle down a little bit. And for one thing, now we have the country of Poland. We get roughly 150,000 Polish people coming to the United States. And the Polish people tend to be one of the groups that is marginalized the most, especially when it comes to Central and Southeastern Europe in particular during this period, because again, like a lot of the second wave immigrants, they have a mindset that they're migrating temporarily, okay, so they don't have a whole lot of reason to want to necessarily assimilate into American culture. They don't always change their language. They don't try to adapt very much, and that ends up riling a lot of Americans in the process. We also get about 50,000 Russians, and the Russians themselves have already got a negative stereotype attached to them because of the Bolshevik Revolution. And this is some fallout of which America ends up dealing with all the way to the present in some cases. Russians are constantly associated with communism, and especially once we get into the period of the Cold War after the Second World War, all of this kind of begins to blow out of proportion. But at this point, people are concerned that Russians are going to be rabble-rousers, that they're going to start some kind of new communist revolution in the United States, potentially assassinate the president or something along those lines. And so this is kind of the first hintings of the Red Scare that we begin to see in the United States. And now also the southern border of the United States becomes a new avenue for people to come into the United States. So we have 150,000 Mexican immigrants coming specifically to be migrant workers in the South and in the Southwest. And once we lead into the period of the Great Depression, we start to see migrant workers who are native-born U.S. citizens come into a few clashes with Mexican immigrants as well. So it creates a whole new dynamic in the South and in the Southwest in terms of ethnic tensions. And by the 1920s, it's estimated that more than half of the working class now are all immigrants. Okay, and the white contingency, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant contingency of the working class in the United States, who are natural-born citizens of the U.S., they have a lot of hatred, quite frankly, for immigrants, because they believe that these immigrants are going to be hired first. They're going to be hired quickly because they are willing to work for less pay. And they end up, in some ways, inching the competition out a little bit. And so if you're a white working class male living in the United States during the 20s, it becomes a little bit harder to find work. And so, again, they look for a scapegoat to blame for this, and typically immigrants tend to bear the brunt of it. And it becomes such a big problem that the U.S. government passes what's called the Emergency Immigration Act in 1921. And this limits the number of immigrants to the United States to only 150,000 people per year. So, I mean, if you look at the little political cartoon up here, we have Uncle Sam with a gigantic funnel, basically, with all these people coming through at the wider end and only a handful coming out the other side. So it's a very good representation of U.S. policy at this point when it comes to immigration. And coupled along with that, we've already got institutions in place that ban the Chinese and the Japanese from sending any working class citizens to the United States, especially unskilled workers. And Latin Americans now take over the role that Southeast Asian immigrants had during the 19th century, because now they're the fastest growing ethnic minority in the United States. And there are 10 times as many Mexican immigrants in Texas at this point as there were at any point beforehand. Okay, and they're primarily known as quote-unquote stoop laborers. Okay, and the stoop aspect of this is quite literally when a person is working in a field, whether it's acting as a fruit picker or gathering cotton, whatever it happens to be, whatever the crop happens to be. They have to stoop over, pick things up, and haul it all back. Okay, so that's kind of where this comes from, right? It's a backbending exercise and a backbending job and a backbreaking job in some cases. And to make matters worse, with all this immigration that's going on in the United States, a lot more people are coming to the U.S. The working class in particular begins to point out specific instances where immigrants are being either accused and or convicted of certain crimes in the U.S. And unfortunately, even in the 21st century, we still see this being used as a tactic by certain aspects of society to try to point out why immigration needs to be curtailed. Okay, and it continues to be a big problem. In May of 1920, we see two guys who are Italian immigrants, a shoemaker named Nicola Sacco and a fishmonger named Bartolomeo Vanzetti, who are both arrested in Boston for apparently stealing and for committing murder in the midst of all this. And again, this is one way that the certain contingency of U.S. society begins to say, see, look at what they're doing. They're messing up our society. They're killing people, blah, blah, blah. And they try to use it as an excuse, again, to further curtail immigration and to try to restore some sense of hegemony here, especially for native-born working-class individuals in the U.S. And again, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, and even specifically among Central Europe, there is still a fear of anarchism. And anarchy hasn't really had as much of an influence in the U.S. at this point compared to communism in terms of the amount of fear that's been installed. Even though anarchism has had its own presence. Okay, anarchism is particularly the belief that a government system is out to merely suppress people. Okay, that government shouldn't exist at all. And so anarchist attacks tend to be a little bit more violent, right? They tend to be aimed at policymakers, at lawmakers, and so forth, bombing attacks and so forth. But communism becomes a more systematic fear over time. And so instances like this actually tend to be much more isolated than what is actually reported. Okay, and the sensationalism of it is what gets people worked up so much. And by the time 1920 comes around, okay, the Ku Klux Klan reemerges in the United States, and it comes out in a completely new form that it never has before. Okay, remember the first iteration of the Klan that we saw during Reconstruction, beginning in 1866, probably only lasted about a year or two in its initial form. Okay, it was very disorganized. It was very decentralized. There was no specific leader or hierarchy or anything like that going along with it. And it was geographically isolated to the south, okay, primarily in the Deep South, right, beginning in Tennessee and going further south from there. But by the time we get to 1920, there's been enough anti-immigrant sentiment and enough ethnocentrism, enough xenophobia, enough racism, quite literally, that the Ku Klux Klan is now a nationwide organization. Okay. And, of course, it becomes the version of the Ku Klux Klan that is so widely recognized in today's society. Okay, you see the image here in the background of Klansmen marching down the street in Washington, D.C. This is the Capitol building in the background. And so it's the recognizable image of the white robes with the pointy hats. And of course the Klan is exactly what the stereotypical image of the Klansman is, right? They only accept white U.S.-born Protestants in particular. And they have a long list of ethnicities and belief systems that they come out against. Okay, so if you're black, if you're a Catholic, if you're a Jew, if you're an immigrant, a communist, they've added atheism to the list now, and they even try to make some kind of an ironic little moral slant on this. If you're a prostitute or if you're an adulterer, you're also added to the list as well. So they have a very strange chemical, I don't know how to put it, right? Some kind of weird component that goes into all this that they kind of add things that don't seem to add up, really, in terms of their whole viewpoint. Of course, they support all kinds of legislative restrictions on immigration, on voting rights, and again, this weird little appendage of strict personal morality that goes along with this seems a little bit antithetical. Okay, it seems like if you're going to be anti all these things, again, maybe I just don't understand the logic of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not sure, but exercising a sense of strict personal morality seems like it would go along with being accepting of other individuals. But again, take from this what you will. I won't get into picking sides on this. At its height in 1923, the Klan boasts over 4 million members in the United States. Okay, and each state in the Union has a different form of Klan prejudice at work. Okay, depending on the ethnic makeup of the region, depending on the immigrant populations, and so forth. So in Texas, the primary target is Mexicans. Okay, in California, it's primarily Japanese Americans, right? These are actually individuals who are a generation or two removed, because now we can't actually even accept any more immigrants from Japan at this point. And in New York, it's primarily Jews and Catholics, okay? And in the Deep South, it's still African Americans. The new aspect of the Klan, too, is that now it is no longer decentralized. It actually has a central figure leading it in the form of David Stevenson, who is known as the quote-unquote Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. He's the guy who is the head honcho, if you like. He's the guy who makes all of the decisions. He's the one who tells all the members what to do. And it's no surprise that he kind of develops this little cult of personality within the Klan, becomes extremely wealthy virtually overnight from collecting membership fees from individuals. And he's not above using violent coercion when it comes to local and state elections. Okay, and now that the Klan has a national presence, they could potentially influence the outcome of national elections too. His little downfall ends up coming about sometime around 1925, because he ends up being arrested for kidnapping and raping a young 28-year-old woman who is so distraught from the entire incident that she later commits suicide. And of course, this gets tons and tons of bad press for him, for the Klan, for their activities, and so it ends up leading into a worse public image than they had before. Okay. The image that you see in the background is actually from the specific march that the Ku Klux Klan does in Washington, D.C. in 1927. And they also do another one in New York City at the same time. And in the aftermath of this particular instance in New York City, 7 members are actually arrested for refusing to disperse a parade, okay, because obviously people are not happy that they're seeing this. This particular fellow, who you may have seen before, you may not have, is the only one of the group who is actually released at the end of this little charade without any charges attached to him. This is Fred Trump. This is the father of our current president. Okay, so again, just stating facts, not picking a side on this or anything, not trying to insert any kind of political agenda here, but these are just the facts of the matter, okay? So everybody who, and the Klan at this point too, this is also worth mentioning, is it's not just the working class in the United States. Now you have individuals who are doctors, lawyers, professionals, teachers, right, congressmen, all right, all the way up the chain, influential individuals all over the United States who are suddenly and secretively members of this organization. Okay, so it's not limited to just a bunch of backwoods fellows who like to scare people and hurt and kill people on the weekends. Okay, it's much more deeply rooted than that at this point. By 1930, though, the public image of the Klan starts to go on the decline a little bit again. They dwindle down to only about 100,000 members nationwide, because there's a lot of anti-Klan laws that are passed over time. And of course, the image of the Klan is not one that most people in the United States really endorse. Okay, obviously the sense of racism, violence, murder, and of course now that we have a specific instance where the Grand Dragon himself has raped and kidnapped a young woman, all these things added together make a very poor public image again. And the presence of Christian fundamentalism in the United States is another very high key feature in the 1920s, and it becomes something that happens in waves more and more beginning in the 1920s, where this new and not really, it's not really a new thing, I shouldn't put it that way. Christian fundamentalism becomes a much more widely recognized and widely accepted form of Christianity in the United States. Because of the rise of evangelism in the United States, especially as we get closer to the midway point around the 1960s and 70s in particular, we start to see these much more mainstream evangelical ministers gaining almost celebrity status in the United States for their belief systems, for their influence in politics and so forth. So this is kind of the beginning of some of that. And Christian fundamentalists tend to be extremely anti-liberal, at least at this point in time, and for the most part that hasn't really changed a whole lot. Okay, and the key feature of Christian fundamentalism, what makes it a fundamentalist belief, is that the fundamentalists believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. In other words, all of the events that happen in the Old Testament, Adam and Eve, Garden of Eden, Moses parting the Red Sea, Noah's Ark, everything that comes from Old Testament stories and so forth is considered to be literal, that it's something that actually did happen in this exact order. And over time, Christian fundamentalism has brought forth more and more beliefs that have been challenged by modern science and so forth. In some cases, Christian fundamentalists claim that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, whereas scientists believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 or more billion years old. So there's all kinds of variances here and varying degrees of fundamentalism. So again, another potentially controversial situation where I leave it to you, the listener, to take from it what you will. But the big conflict that erupts during the 1920s here is something that happens between the fundamentalist Christians and the modernist Christians at the same time. Okay, and modernist Christians are ones who are more of a moderate, middle-of-the-road type of Christian who, in some cases, depending on what your belief system happens to be, the fundamentalists in particular accuse them of being, too bland, of not really exercising their beliefs to their fullest extent, whatever it happens to be. And the fundamentalists are usually viewed somehow and somewhere along the line as some sort of a crackpot, right? Someone who is potentially apocalyptic in their views, who is preaching the end of the world if society doesn't vote for a certain individual and that sort of thing. So the fundamentalists tend to portray everything as a moral dilemma. All of society's ills, all of the potential problems with crime, with immigration, with evolution, with everything else, all of it is pitched as being a battle of ultimate good and evil. Okay, so whether you espouse that belief or not, again, I leave it up to you, but this is just the background of the time period here. And Darwinian evolution becomes one of the key targets for Christian fundamentalism and the big pushback against evolution, because Darwinian evolution has been in existence for the better part of 80 years at this point, right? It's existed as a theory for that long, but there's more of a societal pushback against it now, saying that all of the ills that have been caused by greed and capitalism and so forth in the 19th century are all inextricably tied to evolution because of social Darwinism. And again, Charles Darwin himself absolutely refuted all that and said that it was not worthy of consideration. So this particular type of view is something that people are trying to use as some sort of a potentially optimistic way of viewing the origin of life in the universe, whereas evolution, at best, tends to be indifferent toward that. And certain individuals start to exercise their influence in this particular sphere. The first female governor of Texas, a lady named Miriam Ferguson, sometimes called Ma Ferguson, actually goes so far as to outlaw all textbooks in Texas that contain Darwinism. Okay, so in the South in particular, Darwinian evolution from this point forward, for the better part of 100 years now, is still under fire. Okay, there is still a conservative pushback against this, and the effort to teach Christian creationism in public schools and in private schools in many cases too is constantly being pitched. And one of the most famous, if not the most famous, public scandal about this concerns what's called the Scopes quote-unquote monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925. And it surrounds a substitute teacher for a science class named John Scopes, who you see here. And Scopes actually comes to this particular school in Dayton, and the school has mandated that creationism should be taught in school. And Scopes himself actually comes in and begins teaching Darwinian evolution instead. Okay. And immediately this incenses the school board, it incenses the public, and everybody gets up in arms over this individual teaching this particular doctrine that not everybody agrees with. And so an individual named Clarence Darrow, who's a very famous attorney of the time, is hired to represent John Scopes at the trial. And William Jennings Bryan, who we've seen several times over, right, ran for president in 1896, served as Secretary of State for Woodrow Wilson during the First World War, is getting on in years at this point, and actually is called in to be the expert witness for the prosecution against John Scopes for all this. So again, another evangelical minister coming in and acting in a very dramatic manner for a courtroom, right? So this entire scenario plays out over the course of 7 weeks. It was actually made into a very famous film in the 1940s, I believe, called Inherit the Wind. And it, again, it surrounds this entire situation here with Scopes, and whether or not this is constitutional to teach this, whether it is something that should be punished or not. And the outcome is that John Scopes is found guilty of the crime of teaching Darwinian evolution. He's initially charged $100 as a fine for doing this, but it ends up being waived on a technicality. Okay. And parenthetically, after he gives his expert testimony to the court, William Jennings Bryan actually dies a few days later. Okay, and as you can see here, this photo of him is actually taken during the trial. This was in the midst of the summer in Dayton, Tennessee. It's extremely hot. There's no air conditioning. He's fanning himself here. You can tell he's kind of flustered here. He was already getting on in years, and it's estimated that he may have died from heat stroke or heart failure or both. Okay, so we finally we see the end of William Jennings Bryan's career in this particular instance. Okay, but again, the Scopes trial sets a precedent for the type of pushback that evolution ends up encountering in American politics, and especially in the South, for generations to come. And of course, one of the biggest key features of the 1920s, and one of the most recognizable aspects of it, is the Prohibition Era. Okay, in 1919, a year after World War I ends, Congress passes the 18th Amendment, ratifies it. Okay, and the 18th Amendment is what ultimately says that you cannot possess or make any kind of alcohol or purchase any kind of alcohol after January 1st of 1920. So anything that involves, quote, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors in whatever form they happen to take. And there's several different ways that alcohol can be made, several different ingredients that can be used, anything from beer to wine to gin to whiskey to vodka, you name it. Any or all of the above is considered illegal. And there are several different excuses that are used for why this is passed, and it seems like it is passed at a very inopportune time, because if you have soldiers coming back from the war, many of whom are suffering still potentially from shell shock or anything of that nature, they've got a lot of nervous tics, they've got a lot of mental health issues. Not that alcohol will necessarily make it better, but doctors would prescribe medicinal alcohol in some cases to soldiers to help them calm themselves a bit. Okay, so for the government to actually outlaw this seems like a bad idea. Wartime rationing is one of the excuses that's made because, again, we're still in the midst of trying to recover a bit from the war, saying that if we allow this type of thing to continue to be made, right, we're taking away from our armed forces by keeping certain grains or potatoes or whatever the ingredients happen to be for whatever alcohol is being made. And ethnic prejudice becomes another thing. Again, people start to boycott German breweries because they say, well, it's a patriotic thing if you don't buy from German breweries because they're Germans, right, or something along those lines. And again, sometimes they try to cast this as a test of patriotism somehow. If you can abstain from doing this, then you're doing the right thing in the eyes of Uncle Sam, right? You're supporting our boys overseas and all this kind of stuff. So there's all kinds of little thinly put together excuses that are all kind of corroborated here at the same time to try to support this argument. And the Volstead Act becomes kind of the appendage for the 18th Amendment, and that it is the full list of rules and regulations that go along with the 18th Amendment, right? How it's going to be enforced. The ironic thing about this is drinking itself is still legal. Okay, if you have alcohol in your possession, okay, you are still allowed to drink it after January 1st of 1920. Okay, it is still technically a legal thing. You are not allowed to buy it, manufacture it, or transport it is the trick. Okay, so if you stockpile alcohol in the months building up to it, you can live on whatever supply you have until you run out, and then that's it. And I beg your pardon, specifically it's January 16th of 1919. I thought that it was, the date was backdated, I'm sorry. So January 16th of 1919. So you're allowed to keep any alcohol that is owned before January 16th of 1919. Okay, so again, stockpile all you want, but when you run out, that's it. And the loophole here with certain doctors prescribing quote-unquote medicinal alcohol is something that still does hold water to a certain extent. Okay, doctors can say, well, I'm going to prescribe you, a glass of whiskey every day, or I'm going to prescribe you a glass of wine every day because it's good for you, or whatever the case may be, to calm your nerves or something along those lines. And it's usually not necessarily whiskey itself. It might be something with a thinly veiled aspect of alcohol in it, perhaps like laudanum, for example, or you might get something even like absinthe, or in some cases even certain medicinal drinks and so forth would still contain certain even hard drugs, cocaine or heroin or something along those lines, would be added to certain medications during this time period. This is before the Food and Drug Administration comes in and does a major overhaul on all this. But there were loopholes that could be exercised here. And also, if you are a farmer and you want to store fruit in a certain way, okay, this is another very thinly veiled way of doing this. Farmers are allowed to store fruit and vegetables and certain components that make alcohol in a process that fosters fermentation. Okay, so you could potentially store potato mash and yeast or something like that in a particular instance where you would accidentally, quote unquote, end up with a barrel full of vodka, for example, or you put together a barrel full of grapes that are potentially ripening along with some other ingredients, and oops, I accidentally made some wine, right? That kind of thing. So there's all kinds of ways that this could be done. And even in some cases, there was a way to actually buy and or purchase what was essentially a concentrated block of like a dried fruit or something along those lines. You could buy it literally in a brick form, and you just add water and let it sit over the course of a few months, and you end up with alcohol. Okay, so there's all kinds of ways that this ends up being skirted over time, and people find all kinds of creative ways to get around it. But the amazing thing about this is it has the complete opposite effect on American culture and on crime and on everything else in the United States than what the government expects. For one thing, 10% of the government's revenue is completely lost when alcohol is outlawed, okay? Because there's a tax on alcohol. And if you lose the alcohol, you also lose the tax. And not only that, but individuals begin to lose their jobs as well, okay? If you work at a brewery or a distillery or a manufacturing plant or a barrel maker plant or something like that, any one of these types of things, it leads to a chain reaction that causes people to lose work and to not be able to pay their taxes and all kinds of horrible things, and it ends up reaching the government at some point. And of course there's tons of criminal activity that goes into this, right? If you outlaw something, the criminal contingency is going to come in and find a way to sell it illegally. Okay, and the same rules have been applied to the war on drugs ever since. There's a really fascinating book called Chasing the Scream, which deals specifically with how the war on drugs ended up evolving along the same lines as alcohol prohibition, and how it's ended up spiraling out of control and becoming something entirely devastating to society ever since. But police corruption also goes hand in hand with that. So you might have policemen who are being bribed by mafia individuals to actually look the other way. There's ways for people to begin smuggling alcohol across state lines. They would hollow out a gigantic hay bale, for instance, and actually insert a barrel or two of alcohol inside of it. There's all kinds of creative ways that people dealt with this. And of course, one of the biggest figures, if not the biggest figure and the most famous mafia individual in American history, is Alphonse Capone. In the year 1927 alone, he makes $60 million from bootlegging, prostitution, and gambling. Okay, and bootlegging in particular makes a significant chunk of his income. Okay, and he, of course, is one of the only individuals who is willing to engage in this. Right? He's willing to act outside the law because it's making so much money and because so many people want to drink. So, and of course, the prostitution and the gambling tend to be associated with bootlegging through the speakeasies and that type of thing. All three of these things were outlawed in the U.S. at some point. Okay, so Al Capone, again, one of the primary individuals who people would look to in order to get a drink, and of course, it makes him tons of money, and it takes the federal government exercising a loophole of its own to actually catch Capone in the end. They get him for tax evasion, of all things. Now, as it relates to politics in the United States during this period, again, Woodrow Wilson has already gone through his final leg and has experienced a stroke. He's experienced a lessening of power all the way to the end of his days. And once progressivism starts to fade away, we enter into a period where the Republican Party has a brief comeback here. In 1919, though, the champion of the Republican Party, who we've looked toward for the past 20 or so years, Teddy Roosevelt, dies at the age of 60. Okay? And of course, Woodrow Wilson has been disabled by a stroke. He doesn't have a whole lot left in him, so he's not able to run for another term. He's already served 2 terms. Okay? So we have to look to new leadership now. And with regard to all of the price controls and all of the control in particular that the federal government has enacted on the American people during the war, the working class and in particular farmers really have a lot of pushback over this. And so they're eager to find a president who is willing to be more conservative with the way that they handle foreign markets, trying to keep us out of foreign markets in some ways, and to try to, lessen up on the price controls so that farmers can actually try to make a little bit of money and pay off their debts. And of course, there's all kinds of conservative contingencies in American politics who also are tired of seeing a Democratic president in control. Okay, the conservatives who are in favor of prohibition, the Ku Klux Klan, who is constantly, again, fighting for racial superiority, and of course, religious fundamentalism, which in some aspects ends up fighting against a more liberal, progressive aspect of society as well. So there's a large portion of society at this point who is looking for this quote-unquote return to normalcy, is what is the phrase that gets touted so much for this time period. And again, normalcy in this case seems like a step backwards. Okay, it goes against a lot of the progressive movements that the Republican and even Woodrow Wilson, the presidents of the early 20th century so far, have tried to put forward. Okay, so we're returning back to that that kind of laissez-faire attitude toward society again. But regardless, in some ways, the legacy of progressivism does manage to linger on just very briefly. Okay, for one thing, we have the 18th and the 19th Amendments. Again, the 18th Amendment with prohibition, depending on how you look at it, can potentially be viewed as a progressive act. Okay, because again, a lot of the progressivist movements in the late 19th century had to do with temperance, with prohibition, and so forth. So it is kind of a branch of that. And the 19th Amendment, of course, grants universal women's suffrage in 1920. Okay, so that in particular does come to fruition. But both of these amendments are actually holdovers from previous administrations. Okay, so it's kind of the last gasp of progressivism, if you like. And, of course, the progressive movement also focuses on honest government, on business regulation, on trying to eliminate corruption and so forth. But once Woodrow Wilson leaves office finally, a lot of that ends up kind of fizzling very fast. Okay, so we end up going back into a period where the spoils system and corruption and so forth makes another very brief comeback before the Great Depression hits. And so social welfare and public health and education programs, again, just like the honest government and business regulation, don't really have a lot of forward momentum after this. I mean, we do see one or two little minor spikes during this period, but once we get Republican presidents back into the White House, things start to turn in a different direction again. And Warren Harding becomes the Republican candidate in 1909. Actually, this should be 1919, I beg your pardon. He becomes the Republican candidate in 1919 because he is the one who comes out with this idea of a quote-unquote return to normalcy and putting America first. Okay, and this immediately is something that the conservative aspect of society can latch on to, because it likes the idea of keeping America out of foreign affairs, of focusing on domestic policies, trying to improve the economy after the war and everything, even though the economy is doing fairly well at this point. And the reason that Harding is picked over most of the other Republican hopefuls during this period is allegedly that he looks like a president, okay? That he has this kind of stern facial features and kind of a strong attitude about everything, and that's really the only reason why he's picked. An individual named James Cox is chosen as the Democratic candidate. Even though he doesn't gain a whole lot of traction, the individual who does eventually, over time, gain traction is his running mate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, and FDR only has a very minor role in politics at this point. I think he served potentially as, I can't remember if it's senator and governor already of New York. But eventually, over time, he gains much more of a reputation for himself, and of course, as we know, becomes the president during World War II. Harding, at best, though, is considered a mediocre president. Again, he's one of those presidents who is largely forgotten because a lot of the policies that he puts forth don't really go anywhere, or he doesn't actually do very much in terms of policy building. For one thing, most of the big questions that confront Harding's administration are one that he knows absolutely nothing about. Okay, so things like prohibition, things like trying to make sure that the Ku Klux Klan is put out of commission, ways to court religious fundamentalists while still courting the moderate form of Christianity in the United States. He doesn't really know how to be a politician, is the point. And to make matters worse, his private life is riddled with scandals. Okay, he's very much like a reincarnation of Ulysses S. Grant in that regard, except he already doesn't have much of a reputation to begin with. For one thing, he drinks liquor in the White House while it's actually outlawed, right, during Prohibition. He gambles twice a week with his buddies. And he has numerous extramarital affairs as well. Okay, so he's not exactly the pinnacle of moral character that conservatives would hope to see here, but they excuse him because he ends up supporting their bottom line. And the only thing that can really be said for him, and it's minor in comparison, is that he is a little bit more progressive than Woodrow Wilson is when it comes to race relations. Even though there really aren't any individuals who are added to his cabinet who are African Americans or anything like that, he doesn't really, at best he seems indifferent toward the situation, whereas again Woodrow Wilson was more actively opposed to things like the 15th Amendment and that sort of thing. And that's, like I said before, his administration is very similar to Grant's. Okay, he does have a few very good minds operating in his cabinet. Okay, individuals like Charles Evans Hughes as his Secretary of State. Remember, Hughes ran for president in 1916, lost to Woodrow Wilson. Herbert Hoover, who becomes the Secretary of Commerce, right? He was the Secretary of the Food Administration during the First World War, eventually becomes president himself. Andrew Mellon becomes the Secretary of the Treasury, and a lot of Mellon's principles that he comes up with and a lot of his policies during the 1920s, for better or for worse, stabilize the economy briefly until the Great Depression comes around. And finally, Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture. So these four gentlemen are really the only quote-unquote jewels in Harding's crown. The other individuals who are involved in his cabinet are much less scrupulous. And they're known as the Ohio Gang because this is essentially the president's inner circle of friends and drinking buddies. And that's quite frankly what the Ohio Gang was. Okay? Harding himself was a congressman, I believe eventually a senator, in Ohio. And this is where he gets all of his friends from, right? They all come from his home state. They get together, they drink alcohol illegally, and they make bad decisions together. Now, in terms of America's role in foreign affairs, okay, we've already had our mettle tested during World War I. We've come out on top, okay? And again, part of that is due to an accident of geography in this case, right? Our economy and our landscape has not been destroyed by the First World War like everybody else's. But we are the primary banker in the world now, okay? We are the #1 creditor to Europe. And the end game of all this, in actually getting to grant loans to certain parts of Europe, is the fact that Europe is not going to be able to pay us back. Okay? And we don't see the end of the road until the road bottoms out over a cliff and we land in the Depression. In order for Europe to be able to pay back those debts to the United States, though, it has to come up with some sort of a product that the United States wants to purchase. The problem here, though, is that because most of the landscape of Europe has been destroyed, there's not a whole lot that can be produced. Okay? The people of Europe, no matter what nation it is in Central Europe, are starving. Okay? So Germany is not able to come up with much. France is not able to come up with a whole lot of agriculture. Right? Austria-Hungary has been divvied up already. Russia has gone over to the communist side. Great Britain, even in some cases, has lost a large portion of its economy. So there's not really any good measure to look to in this case. And to make matters worse, the United States still has a very high tariff on these things. So if we even do manage to purchase anything from Europe, we end up charging them a ridiculous amount in terms of tariffs, so it's harder for them to pay off their debts. Okay? So in other words, they don't get a whole lot of money from us, and that way they're not able to turn around and pay us much back. And again, the web that we've woven here at the end of the war is part of the reason why we get so heavily entrenched in the Great Depression as well. We've got such a confusing route of debt responsibility here, where we have private bankers who have granted loans to Germany, for example. Germany then still has to pay reparations to Europe, okay? And then the Europeans still have to turn around and repay debts that they have taken out from the United States. So this money comes full circle to the United States again. And this is part of the reason why we continue with kind of an economic stability of sorts anyway, until suddenly Europe's economy completely bottoms out and we go over the edge with them. In 1921, we also sponsor a naval peace conference in Washington, D.C. That's what you see here in the background. And what happens here is America approaches the topic of the navies of the world with a brand new standard that it wants to impose to keep America as the strongest force in the world. We agree that we are going to junk 30 battleships and cruisers, and Britain and Japan, the next two strongest navies in the world, are going to get rid of 36. Okay? So the reduction of armaments is something that was pretty heavily entrenched in the Treaty of Versailles, and this is kind of the fulfillment of that, to try to ensure that war doesn't exactly ramp up as quickly as it did before, and that we don't get into direct competition with each other. It doesn't last long, but it has a little bit of an effect here. And this is called the Five-Power Treaty, okay? And it divides the world into 3 specific regions where each one of these primary I won't necessarily call them superpowers, because that term doesn't really get used until after the Second World War. But the three strongest powers in the world end up taking over three specific regions. Okay, so the United States, for instance, has control of the entire western hemisphere of the Earth. Okay, that's a lot of territory. For Japan, we have Japan taking control of the Western Pacific, and again, this is potentially invasive to the United States because we still have control of the Philippines at this point. And Great Britain gets everything from the North Sea, right on Britain's eastern border here, all the way to Singapore. Okay, so all the way across Central Europe to Singapore. Okay, this is a lot of territory. It's essentially the entire northern hemisphere of the Earth, northeastern hemisphere, I guess you could say. And certain contingencies of the American public even go so far as to try to be optimistic and outlaw war altogether. Okay? And there is actually a committee that's formed in 1921 called the American Committee for the Outlawry of War. Obviously, this is a very naive way of looking at things, and most people in the world are actually involved at this point in ramping up production again gradually, okay, and in the anticipation of another war. But there is, again, there's enough of a support for it where people actually try to do this. And the French even go so far as to try to noodle a new agreement together with the United States to try to avoid this again. In 1927, they proposed what they call an eternal peace treaty with the United States. In other words, if there is another war like this, the United States and France will not be enemies in this regard. And instead, Harding looks at this and he says, well, this is not really what we have in mind. Okay, and actually, this is not Harding at this point. It's Calvin Coolidge, I believe. Looks at this and says, look, this is a bad idea, right? We don't need to sign an eternal peace treaty with you, because if you start getting involved in doing something horrendous, right, then suddenly we are culpable in that regard, and we're bound by this contract to actually come to your aid. So we're not going to bind ourselves that much to it, but instead we're going to sign what's called the Pact of Paris in 1928. And this says when it comes to war, we're going to renounce it as an instrument of national policy. In other words, we're not going to immediately resort to war. We're going to use it as a last-ditch effort, right? A last line of defense as a loophole. So it's going to be the last thing that we do on the list is to go to war. We don't want to do it immediately. And to kind of alienate the rest of the world, the United States refuses to join the World Court. Okay, and the World Court is held in The Hague in the Netherlands. Okay, this is a worldwide tribunal that looks at crimes against humanity. Okay, war crimes in particular. So anytime after this particular point, if there is a specific ruler or if there's a specific country that ends up violating a convention of some kind and commits crimes against humanity, they're tried at The Hague. Okay, so, and again, us not willing to join that, again, is part of kind of a Republican mandate at this point, because the Republican Party already doesn't like the idea of a League of Nations. They've already prevented us from getting involved there. And they also don't like the idea of us being involved in anything that's really going to question our sovereignty somehow. Okay? And the World Court, makes us beholden to a quote-unquote foreign power. We do, however, have a few improved Latin American relations. We've had a pretty strained relationship with Colombia for a while over the Panama Canal, but we've managed to pay them $25 million for perpetual rights to it. In 1924, we finally leave the Dominican Republic after we have intervened in their affairs for the past 8 years. This is part of that Roosevelt corollary. But we also get into a strained relationship with Nicaragua under the revolutionary leader Cesar Augusto Sandino, and between us and Mexico over oil expropriation, right? Now that we are actually manufacturing a lot of cars in the U.S., our oil supply is very quickly running out, okay? And this is when we kind of start to look elsewhere to find oil. And using the Roosevelt corollary as a partial excuse anyway, we begin taking oil from Mexico, and we end up upsetting Mexico as a result. Okay, so gradually, we haven't made our way to the Middle East yet, but we're getting there. Now, with the Harding administration, just like we had with Ulysses S. Grant, we have a ton of scandals that are involved here that end up getting the Republican Party in bad odor with the American public all over again. In 1923 alone, we have a number of scandals that end up really giving Harding a very bad reputation with America. For one thing, his director of the Veterans Bureau, a guy named Charles Forbes, ends up resigning in disgrace after he's convicted of stealing medical supplies. Okay? And this eventually leads to him being tried and imprisoned for doing so. And a few weeks later, it's revealed that his legal advisor actually committed suicide after the fact. So this is a pretty big and bad situation here when an individual has lost their life. The U.S. Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, is actually convicted of selling federal political positions and also of taking German assets that have been seized after the war and selling them as well. Okay, so wartime profiteering is what we would call this today. Jesse Smith, who you see here, the fellow with the mustache, he's the assistant U.S. Attorney General. He's found shot to death after he tells his boss that he is going to, quote, quit the racket. Okay, so we've already got a tinge of organized crime going on here, and with a suspicious murder on top of suicide and corruption and everything else, it seems like Harding's administration is pretty steeped in things that it can't get out of. The biggest element, though, in the Harding administration and the most famous scandal of the time is called the Teapot Dome scandal. And it concerns the Teapot Dome oil field in Wyoming, which has been used as an oil reserve to provide fuel for warships in the U.S., in other words. And it's a government-owned oil field that is then turned around and granted over to other individuals along the way. Okay, Albert Fall is the name of the fellow who's kind of behind all this. He ends up selling contracts to supporters, enacting the spoil system and all that. Amounts to somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think, $400,000 during his period in office. And of course, he's eventually found out, convicted of conspiracy, bribery, and serves a year in prison for doing so. And the fellow who actually, ironically, tells Warren Harding to try to distance himself from all this is Herbert Hoover, who ends up having his own negative reputation over time. And people are starting to get concerned because Hoover tries his best to avoid being blackmailed in all this, because it's become more and more evident that Harding is actually directly involved in some of these events. And so Hoover tells Harding that if you're going to avoid blackmail, not only distance yourself from it, but publish the information yourself. That way you actually prevent people from getting on your bad side, right? You actually come out and tell the American public about it. Maybe they'll support you more than if you keep it a secret. But before he can do that, Harding actually contracts food poisoning while on a trip in San Francisco and dies of a heart attack. Okay, so the illness itself strains his body so much, and Harding is apparently in such poor health from alcoholism and all kinds of problems that his body gives out. So with the death of Warren Harding, we now get the ascension of his vice president Calvin Coolidge to the presidency. And Coolidge has already gotten a reputation for being pretty hardline when it comes to things like being against the whole movement of organized labor. Right, we had the Boston police go on strike after the First World War, and he intervened as the governor of Massachusetts, told them to knock it off. This is not something where you need to put people's safety at risk. Okay, and he's a very different president from Warren Harding. Harding, again, very much like Grant in his treatment of the office, right, using the spoil system, abusing it in many regards, being full of all kinds of different scandals and so forth. But Coolidge is very much a cool-headed kind of guy, right? He's nicknamed Silent Cal because he's kind of got this very stoic demeanor, right? Doesn't really say a whole lot, and it's just kind of a middle-of-the-road sort of president, okay? Kind of a moderate Republican in terms of everything that the party tends to want. He is appealing to voters, too, for that very reason, right? He's not really extreme in one regard or another, and the other thing, too, is he's not really an activist president, okay? He doesn't go above and beyond trying to create new legislation. He doesn't try to use the office for anything innovative. So he's almost a return to a kind of a pre-Teddy Roosevelt type presidency, okay? Kind of along the same lines, perhaps, as William McKinley or someone along those lines. My favorite bit of trivia about Coolidge is something that seems kind of uncharacteristic for him, given his kind of, again, kind of bland personality type, is the fact that he used to like to play pranks on the Secret Service. He would call, there was an emergency button that he would press on the underside of the desk in the Oval Office, and when the Secret Service would come in thinking that he was in danger or something, he would actually hide under the desk and have them search all over the place in a big panic, and basically then pop up and be like, ha ha, fooled you, you know, that kind of thing. So, again, seems kind of out of the ordinary for him, but, you know, not a whole lot else can really be said about Coolidge in terms of his personality and everything. That's just kind of, again, a weird little tidbit. The other thing that makes Coolidge appealing to people who are traditional Republicans in the sense of, you know, going back to pre-Teddy Roosevelt, pre-progressivism, is the fact that he still is very much a proponent of the idea of the Laissez-Faire Policies. Okay, he is famous for saying the business of America is business. Okay, so basically, remove government regulations on business, let things kind of go back to the way they are, let the country run the way it's supposed to run, and the government doesn't intervene all that much. Okay, so he is very much a proponent of small government in that regard. He ends up lowering taxes, lowers a lot of government regulations, again, as it relates to factories and so forth. So, again, not exactly a return to what the working class necessarily wants to see in a president, but for, you know, white middle-class conservatives living in the United States, Coolidge is kind of the par for the course. And again, he's not too keen on having new legislation come about, right? He's not really a proponent of writing legislation or even approving it. He ends up vetoing about 50 acts of Congress while he's president. Like a few presidents that we'll see moving on further into the 20th century, he's really obsessed with the idea of reducing federal spending. He thinks that, you know, the government is wasting way too much money on different social activism and that kind of thing, and so he ends up reducing a lot of that over time, and some of that ends up kind of coming back in a certain regard, really, to bite America in the butt once the Great Depression occurs. Okay, we're only a few years away from that. And again, Coolidge is considered kind of this safe candidate, right? Kind of like what we saw during the laissez-faire period of republicanism in the 19th century, right? With guys like Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, right? Characters who are really only put into the presidency because they are kind of this vanilla candidate, right? They don't seem like they can really do a whole lot of damage. And the Democratic Party, in the meantime, is going through a lot of issues, right? They got plenty of sectional interests that are going on in the United States, right? We've got the southern part of the United States that is really ramping up conservatism at this point, right? We've got the reintroduction of the Ku Klux Klan that's now a nationwide thing. Again, we've got the Scopes monkey trial. We've got creationism versus evolution fighting with one another. So there's a lot of social division that Democrats have a lot of issues they have to field. And the Republicans, meanwhile, get a lot of support from their contingency, right? Not really so much of a division in the ranks there. The Democratic nominee in 1924 is John Davis, a guy who, again, we don't really get a whole lot of information about him because he's the Democrats can't even agree necessarily on who it is that they want to represent them at this point. So Coolidge kind of ends up, because he's, again, still kind of this vanilla candidate, right? He's played it safe so far, so we're going to keep him in office a little bit longer. And Robert La Follette, who we saw come up with the idea of the Wisconsin Plan, right? This move toward creating a city commissioner, city management, and so forth. He becomes a third-party candidate to try to kind of challenge these two in that regard. There he is. And in the 1924 election, Coolidge manages to win the popular vote to an overwhelming capacity compared to the other two candidates, right, at 15.7 million. The 1928 election, meanwhile, again, we get all the way through another 4 years under Coolidge, and he announces in 1927 that he's not going to try to run for re-election, right? He's going to try to just step down, let someone else take over. And so Herbert Hoover now steps in to become the Republican nominee. Okay, and Hoover has already got a pretty decent reputation, right? He's worked for the Food Administration during World War I. He has worked in multiple different government offices. He's worked under the Harding administration. And so he's had a constant presence in politics this entire time. So the track record that he's had, spotty though it may be, right? And again, individuals like Warren Harding say that, you know, Coolidge doesn't, or that Hoover doesn't really give a whole lot of good advice whenever he does give advice. It ends up kind of coming back to bite us in the long run. And Hoover makes a lot of promises that in the long run he cannot fulfill. And Hoover, again, in retrospect, it tends to get blamed quite a bit for the stock market crash, for the Great Depression, and part of that is because of the promises that he makes. Right? He tells the American people that under his administration, every man will have a job, everybody will have a chicken in every pot, right? Everybody's going to have this continued sense of economic prosperity that we saw all the way through the 1920s because of the economic windfall from before and during the First World War. The problem, though, is, again, because America is in this kind of non-sustainable high that it's riding on, the crash ends up being so difficult. We don't really anticipate the fact that once loans are called back in, once the economy starts to dip, that it's not going to, you know, go back on an upswing anytime soon. Okay, so again, Hoover is promising Americans that they're going to have prosperity, and in reality, you know, within a year of him actually coming into office, the stock market crashes. And again, Hoover's got a list of a reputation of all kinds of different successes, right? He's a mining engineer, becomes an oil tycoon, a multimillionaire, all before the age of 40. Okay, so he seems to, again, kind of know what he's doing, at least on the outside, in terms of what he's been able to accomplish. He served at the peace delegations at Versailles under Woodrow Wilson. And he refers to himself as a progressive conservative, okay, which seems kind of like a contradiction in terms to a certain degree. Progressive, again, in the sense that he is advocating for the same types of things as what we would see under maybe Teddy Roosevelt, or more along the lines of William Howard Taft, in the sense that he doesn't really doesn't come out with any necessarily new legislation, or at least only is half-hearted about it. He never actually follows through on a lot of his stuff. But conservative for sure, because he is still a member of the Republican Party, which is now growing into a more conservative establishment at this point. And he likes the idea of having service to the American people over competition. So he's not really so much a fan of the laissez-faire policies in terms of people stabbing each other in the back, but he is interested in you know, providing as many services for the American people as he can, but at the same time, too, over time, he ends up kind of backpedaling on some of those promises, especially once he realizes the economy is not going to last in the way that he hoped. Alfred Smith becomes the New York Democratic nominee. You see him here. Initially, he seems like he's going to be kind of this hero for the working class. He's got the reputation that goes along with being, you know, an immigrant, from being someone who is kind of this self-made individual, right? He comes from poverty. He serves as an example. The problem, though, is that he ends up alienating a certain portion of his own contingency, right, within the Democratic Party. So he criticizes Prohibition, which doesn't necessarily harm him so much with the Catholic contingency, but certainly with Protestantism, right? Protestant Christians living in the South, conservatives especially, don't like the idea of doing away with Prohibition. So he loses some support there. And again, he is Roman Catholic as well, so he still has the the vote of Northern Democrats, but again, he doesn't really gain Southern Democrat support so much. And the Ku Klux Klan goes so far as to identify him as the Antichrist at one point, simply because he doesn't really support Protestant Christian values, at least in the South at this point. And Hoover, of course, because he's kind of already had this reputation in politics, and because the Republican Party's been riding high for a while now, he ends up winning by a landslide. Okay, 21 million popular votes, which is far and away what it was in 1924 and before, and 444 electoral votes. So an absolute landslide victory for Hoover. And in the meantime, the Republicans also managed to keep control of both houses of Congress, and we enter into a period where the Republican Party seems like it is, kind of riding on the flagship of the United States now, right? It has ascended to the highest point that it can, where the legislative and executive branches are both under firm control of it. But of course, we're hurtling very quickly toward disaster. And Coolidge, again, is the one who claims that, and it was Coolidge, I beg your pardon. Coolidge says that anytime that Herbert Hoover gave unsolicited advice on something, it was always bad advice. Okay, again, Coolidge kind of seems to be this middle-of-the-road kind of guy. Hoover seems to kind of take it in his own direction, and as we'll see over time, and once we get into the next chapter, when the bottom falls out, Hoover gains a lot of flack for what happens to America.